The pre-dawn darkness of Denver International Airport wrapped around Captain Sarah Mitchell like a familiar blanket as she walked across the tarmac toward the Bombardier Q400. Her uniform was pressed to razor-sharp perfection, the captain's bars on her shoulders catching the pale orange light of the runway markers. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, every strand in place, every detail of her appearance a masterpiece of professional composure. No one watching her stride toward the aircraft would see anything unusual, just another pilot heading out on a routine Tuesday morning flight. But beneath that pressed uniform, beneath the carefully constructed facade of her professional identity, Sarah Mitchell carried secrets that few people in her life understood or fully appreciated. She'd been flying regional routes for the better part of 15 years now, working her way up through the ranks of the regional airline with quiet determination and an unblemished safety record. Her colleagues respected her without quite understanding her. She wasn't the type to go out for drinks after a shift, wasn't interested in the gossip that circulated through the crew lounge, never seemed to want to discuss her personal life. She showed up on time, she performed flawlessly, and she seemed to exist in a state of perpetual calm that made some of her fellow pilots either envy her or feel vaguely intimidated in her presence. The newer first officers who flew with her often commented that she was like flying with a computer, efficient, precise, utterly reliable. They didn't realize that the precision they witnessed wasn't mechanical at all. It was purposeful. It was trained into every fiber of her being. What they didn't know was that every third weekend of the month, Sarah Mitchell disappeared. She left her apartment in the Denver suburbs on Friday evening, drove to a nondescript military installation 2 hours north, and became someone else entirely. She became Major Sarah Phoenix Mitchell of the Colorado Air National Guard, 144th Fighter Wing. She became a pilot of F-16 Fighting Falcons, high-performance jets that demanded everything a human being could give them. She became part of a brotherhood and sisterhood of military aviators who lived and breathed a completely different code of conduct. In that world, she wasn't the invisible captain that civilian passengers overlooked. She was a respected combat-trained pilot whose skills and judgment were tested daily against the most demanding scenarios aviation could produce. The two identities didn't coexist peacefully. They collided constantly in Sarah's mind, pulled her in different directions, demanded different things from her. Her ex-husband, David, had never understood it. "Why do you need both?" he'd asked during one of their final arguments, his frustration evident in every syllable. "Isn't flying for the airline enough? Why do you have to spend every free moment strapping into a fighter jet?" Sarah had tried to explain it to him, had tried to articulate the need that burned inside her chest, the need to push beyond limits, to train for moments when people needed her most, to be more than just competent. She tried to tell him that the military flying wasn't separate from her civilian career, that it was actually essential to making her better at everything she did. But David had left anyway, unable to accept that his wife's passion for aviation and self-improvement would always come before domestic life. Sometimes Sarah wondered if she should regret that. Usually, she didn't. Her friends at the airline knew her as a devoted professional with a quiet determination and an almost monastic commitment to her work. They knew she lived alone, that she read extensively about aviation history and engineering, that she attended every safety seminar offered, that she seemed to live and breathe the technical aspects of flying with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. What they didn't know was that she spent her weekends in fighter jets, pulling G-forces that made her internal organs shift in her body, making split-second decisions at speeds that would cause most people's minds to freeze completely. They didn't know that she'd been trained in tactical combat scenarios, that she'd practiced emergency ejections, that she'd spent countless hours studying how to keep a severely damaged aircraft flying long enough to reach safety. They didn't know that she had a call sign, Phoenix, earned after she'd ejected from a damaged F-16 during a training exercise, spent 3 weeks recovering from injuries, and fought her way back through medical evaluations to return to flight status. rising from the ashes. That was what Phoenix meant to her. The cognitive dissonance of living two lives wasn't something she discussed with anyone. Her squadron mates at the military installation knew her as a dedicated, slightly reserved pilot who was better than most and worked harder than everyone. They knew her as someone who took every training scenario with deadly seriousness, who volunteered for the most challenging assignments, who seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. They didn't know about the regional flights, about the 190 passengers she carried from city to city, about the responsibility she felt toward people who had no idea they were being piloted by someone trained in ways most commercial pilots never experienced. They saw her as a military pilot, period. But Sarah existed in both worlds completely, unable to truly leave either one. The military flying made her better at her civilian job. The discipline, the emergency training, the constant push toward mastery. And the civilian flying kept her grounded, reminded her that beyond the adrenaline and the glory, there were real people who depended on her, families who wanted their loved ones to arrive safely at their destinations. Both identities had shaped her into something neither world alone could have created. As she climbed the stairs into the Q400, Sarah ran through the familiar ritual of her pre-flight inspection. The aircraft was a medium-range regional turboprop, reliable and dependable, not particularly exciting but entirely trustworthy. She knew this aircraft intimately, knew every system, every quirk, every possible failure mode. She'd spent hundreds of hours in similar aircraft, and she maintained the same level of attention to detail and preparation that she brought to flying F-16s. Some of her colleagues thought she was obsessive, spending 45 minutes on a pre-flight inspection when most pilots could accomplish it in 30. But Sarah didn't rush. She understood at a fundamental level that preparation was a form of insurance, that the time spent now studying her aircraft was an investment in her ability to handle whatever came later. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of Colorado weather that promised a smooth flight. Sarah entered the cockpit and ran her hands along the controls, feeling the familiar weight and balance of the aircraft. She checked the fuel levels, the hydraulic pressure, the engine parameters. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. She had no way of knowing that this flight would be anything other than ordinary, that the careful attention she paid to every detail was about to become the most important preparation of her entire life, that the two worlds she'd worked so hard to keep separate were about to collide in spectacular and terrifying fashion. But that was still 42 minutes away. For now, there was only the pre-dawn calm, the routine of preparation, and the quiet knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, a pilot about to carry 190 people safely to their destination, armed with years of training that most of them would never even know about. The boarding process had been unremarkable. 190 passengers filtered through the narrow galley of the Bombardier Q400, finding their seats in the regional airliner with the typical mixture of resignation and indifference. Some pulled out phones and tablets, immediately disconnecting from the world around them. Others settled into conversation with traveling companions. A mother in row 12 tried to keep her two young children entertained with a collection of small toys, while her husband dozed off before they'd even left the gate. An elderly couple held hands as they navigated to their seats, having clearly flown together countless times. To all of them, this was simply another Tuesday morning flight, unremarkable, routine, one of thousands happening across the country at that exact moment. None of them knew they were about to experience the most significant morning of their lives. Sarah had completed every pre-flight check with her characteristic thoroughness. She'd walked the perimeter of the aircraft, checking the fuselage for damage, verifying that fuel caps were secure, inspecting the landing gear for any signs of wear or leakage. She'd verified the weight and balance calculations, ensuring that the aircraft's center of gravity was within acceptable parameters. She'd confirmed fuel quantity and quality, checking that the aviation fuel met specification and that there was sufficient quantity for the planned flight with appropriate reserves. She'd reviewed weather along the route, noted wind speeds at altitude, confirmed that Denver International was clear for their arrival. Everything had checked out perfectly. The aircraft was well maintained, the crew was experienced, the weather was excellent. By every objective measure, this was an ideal flight, the kind of flight that should proceed exactly as planned. Marcus Chen arrived in the cockpit at 6:47 a.m., 15 minutes before their scheduled departure. He was in his early 30s, a competent first officer with about 8 years of commercial aviation experience. He was chatty, personable, the kind of co-pilot who tried to engage Sarah in conversation during their pre-flight briefing. She appreciated his professionalism, though she could have done without the running commentary about his weekend plans. He'd met someone, he explained, and they'd gone hiking in the mountains. He seemed genuinely excited about it. Sarah had listened politely, asked appropriate follow-up questions, and then shifted the conversation back to the flight plan. She had no idea that this casual conversation would be something she'd replay in her mind dozens of times over the coming hours and days. The takeoff had been normal. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, the aircraft accelerated down the runway, and they lifted into the clear Colorado sky at 7:02 a.m. Sarah handled the controls smoothly, following the departure procedure with practiced ease. They climbed through 5,000 feet, then 10,000 feet, and eventually leveled off at 18,000 feet, their assigned cruise altitude. The aircraft settled into its steady cruising configuration, the engines humming with that constant, reassuring sound that Sarah had heard thousands of times. The autopilot engaged, and the aircraft continued on its pre-programmed flight path toward their destination. From the perspective of anyone watching the radar screen at Denver Air Traffic Control, Flight 447 was simply another aircraft following its expected trajectory, climbing to altitude, and proceeding along the planned route. It was at 7:44 a.m., approximately 42 minutes into the flight, that something changed. Sarah felt it first as a subtle vibration transmitted through the control column into her hands. It was not dramatic, not alarming in itself, just a slight tremor that ran through the aircraft systems. She frowned slightly, her attention sharpening immediately. Her mind ran through the possibilities with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to diagnose aircraft systems under stress. Was it turbulence? She checked the weather radar. No turbulent cells in their path. Was it normal oscillation in the autopilot? Unlikely. The autopilot was stable and responsive. Was it something in the hydraulic systems? Possibly. Or something in the engines? She glanced at Marcus, who was focused on his tablet, reviewing the next segment of the flight. He hadn't noticed anything. Sarah's eyes moved to the engine instruments before her. The right engine was showing normal parameters, normal manifold pressure, normal turbine inlet temperature, normal fuel flow rate. Everything in the green. But Sarah had learned something in 18 years of military aviation that couldn't be taught in any formal classroom. She'd learned to trust the symphony of sensations that an aircraft communicated to a pilot through 1,000 subtle signals. And right now, something in that symphony was off-key. She reached out and manually checked the autopilot trim, confirming that it was responding normally. The vibration persisted, slight, almost imperceptible to someone not trained to detect such things. Sarah's military instincts had been honed through thousands of hours of training in aircraft far more sophisticated and demanding than this regional turboprop. In an F-16, every vibration, every deviation from normal behavior was significant. Pilots who ignored subtle signals didn't come home. Pilots who paid attention to every small anomaly, who investigated discrepancies between what the instruments showed and what the aircraft felt like, were the ones who survived. "Marcus," she said, keeping her voice casual despite the alert status of her nervous system, "can you run a secondary check on the right engine systems?" He looked up from his tablet, a small expression of confusion crossing his face. Secondary check. Everything looks nominal from here. System parameters all green. I know, Sarah said, maintaining her calm demeanor. Just want to be thorough. Something feels slightly off. Marcus set his tablet aside and reached for the flight engineer's panel, which on this aircraft was limited compared to larger commercial jets, but sufficient to access detailed engine diagnostics. He began running through the secondary check system, verifying pressures, temperatures, and flow rates against the baseline parameters. Sarah kept her hands on the control column, feeling the aircraft, waiting. The vibration was still there, subtle, persistent, a whisper of something wrong beneath the normal operating sounds. Everything's checking out perfectly, Marcus said after a few moments. All readings are within normal limits. Engine health is good. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the instruments before her. She'd been flying too long, trained too extensively, to dismiss what her senses were telling her. Something was developing. She could feel it the way a sailor felt a change in wind, the way a musician heard an instrument beginning to drift out of tune. It wasn't anything dramatic yet, just the beginning of something, the first warning sign that something was starting to go wrong. Keep monitoring it, Sarah said quietly. Let me know immediately if you see anything, even the slightest anomaly. Of course, Marcus said, though she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He didn't sense what Sarah sensed, but he trusted her judgment enough not to question it further. Sarah settled back in her seat, her hands remaining alert on the controls, her mind running through scenarios and contingencies. The vibration continued its subtle presence. The engines continued their normal operation. The aircraft carried 190 people through the clear Colorado morning, completely unaware that somewhere in the carefully engineered systems that kept them aloft, something was beginning to fail. It was the first time that day Sarah acknowledged the possibility that this flight might not go exactly as planned. It was the first warning, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. But Sarah Mitchell had built her entire life on the principle that you never ignored the small warnings. Because small warnings, if left unchecked, had a tendency to become catastrophes. The silence was suffocating. That was the first thing that struck Sarah as the immediate emergency unfolded, not the catastrophic nature of losing both engines, not the violent shudder of the second engine dying, not even the flames that had rippled across the left wing. It was the silence, the constant, reassuring hum of the engines that had surrounded them since takeoff was simply gone, replaced by an eerie, haunting whisper of air rushing past the fuselage. The sound was almost supernatural in its wrongness, the sound of an aircraft that was no longer flying, but was instead beginning the inevitable process of falling. Sarah's hands gripped the control yoke with a force born of absolute focus. The aircraft had become fundamentally different in the last 3 seconds. It was no longer a powered machine that could climb, that could adjust altitude, that could recover from mistakes. It was now a very large, very heavy glider, a tube of aluminum and human beings descending toward the earth with nothing but the laws of physics to determine their fate. Every decision she made now mattered in ways that defied conventional thought. Every movement of the control surfaces had to be precise, calculated, purposeful. There was no margin for error. There was no second chance if she miscalculated the glide ratio or the descent angle. 12,000 feet, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly as he called out their altitude. 11,500, 11,000. The descent rate was alarming, faster than Sarah would have wanted, but not yet catastrophic. The key to surviving this situation was managing the energy the aircraft still possessed. Every foot of altitude was potential, was runway distance, was time. Sarah began working through the mental calculations that her military training had burned into her consciousness through countless emergency scenarios. Glide ratio for a Q400 was approximately 15:1, meaning for every 15 units of horizontal distance, the aircraft would descend 1 unit vertically. They were at 11,000 feet. That meant they had roughly 165,000 feet of horizontal distance before reaching the ground. Their airspeed was currently 165 knots. At that speed, they could travel approximately 27.5 miles before running out of altitude. The math was grim but not impossible. Eagle County Airport was 42 miles away. Denver International, where they'd been headed, was even farther, but there had to be something closer. Sarah's mind was already sorting through the Colorado landscape, cataloging every small airfield, every open stretch of terrain that might serve as a landing zone. She'd flown this route hundreds of times. She knew this region intimately. "There," Marcus said, pointing toward the windscreen. Sarah followed his gaze and saw it. A small airfield carved out of the Colorado mountains, maybe 35 miles ahead. Eagle County. It would be close, brutally close, but mathematically possible if she managed the descent perfectly. In the cabin behind the cockpit, panic had begun to metastasize. Sarah could hear it in the voices of the flight attendants, in the rising pitch of conversations that ranged from confused to terrified. A woman was praying, her voice audible even through the cockpit door. A child was crying, not the regular crying of a tired traveler, but the primal wailing of terror. A man was demanding to know what was happening, insisting that someone tell him what was wrong. The sounds of 190 people confronting their own mortality filled the fuselage with a cacophony of human fear and desperation. Sarah forced herself to tune it out. She could do nothing about the panic in the cabin. She could only manage the physics of the descent. She could only focus on the immediate, solvable problem in front of her, getting this aircraft on the ground in one piece. "All right," she said, her voice cutting through the radio chatter and the ambient noise like a blade. "We're going to make it to Eagle County. I'm going to manage this descent, and we're going to land this aircraft." She said it with a certainty that she absolutely did not feel, but she said it with the weight of 18 years of military aviation behind it, with the authority of someone who had trained specifically for moments when everything was falling apart. "Marcus, I need you to calculate our glide ratio continuously. Every 1,000 feet, I want an update on whether we're tracking for the airport or whether we're losing efficiency." Marcus nodded, his fear transmuting into purpose. He had something to do. He had a role to play. The act of having a responsibility seemed to ground him. His fingers flew across the flight engineer's panel, working calculations with the intensity of someone understanding that the numbers he produced might be the difference between life and death. Sarah began making minute adjustments to the control surfaces. Every turn had to be shallow, had to minimize the additional descent caused by banking the aircraft. Every adjustment to pitch had to be surgical in its precision. Too much nose down and she'd increase descent rate dramatically. Too much nose up and she'd bleed off airspeed and risk a stall. The aircraft had to remain in the narrow envelope between these two catastrophic possibilities. It was like threading a needle while falling through the sky. The landscape beneath them was mountainous, beautiful in the way that Colorado was beautiful, and utterly unforgiving. Jagged peaks clawed upward, valleys dropped away suddenly, and there was nowhere down there where an airplane could land except the narrow strip of Eagle County Airport. Sarah felt the weight of 190 lives more acutely than she ever had. These weren't abstract numbers. In the cabin behind her were 190 people with names and families and dreams and futures that all depended on the precision of her hand on the control yoke in this moment. She'd ejected from an F-16 once. She'd known in those milliseconds before the ejection seat fired that she might die. She'd felt her body accelerate from 0 to 600 miles per hour in less than a second, felt her spine compress under the force, felt the searing pain of the ejection as she was violently torn from her aircraft. She descended under parachute in a damaged aircraft area, not knowing if she'd be picked up or if enemy forces would find her first. She'd spent 3 weeks recovering from injuries, fighting through physical therapy to return to flight status. She'd learned in those experiences what it meant to face the prospect of death with clarity. She'd learned that panic was a luxury, that fear could be channeled into focus, that the human mind could perform extraordinary things when it understood that there was nothing else to do but perform. This was different and the same. Different because now she was responsible for 190 other people, not just herself. The same because the fundamental requirement hadn't changed: clarity, focus, absolute precision. Sarah Mitchell had been shaped by 18 years of military aviation for a moment exactly like this one. 10,000 feet, Marcus said. Descent rate is stable at 500 feet per minute. Glide ratio is holding at 17-1. We're going to make it. Sarah, we're going to make it. She didn't respond verbally. She just adjusted the pitch control fractionally, feeling the aircraft respond, calculating the wind, estimating the descent angle, projecting the landing distance. The mountains dropped away beneath them. The airfield was still ahead, still distant, but no longer impossible. The silence of the engines continued its haunting whisper, and Sarah Mitchell guided 190 people through that terrible quiet towards salvation. The runway at Eagle County Airport grew larger in Sarah's windscreen with each passing second. It was shorter than she would have chosen under normal circumstances, about 7,000 feet long, which was adequate for the Q400 under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. This was a powerless aircraft descending at 500 feet per minute, carrying weight that should never have been landing on a mountain airfield, with zero margin for error. There was no go-around available. There was no second chance. If she misjudged this landing, if her calculations were even slightly off, the consequences would be catastrophic and immediate. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she assessed the approach. The runway was oriented northwest to southeast, running along the valley floor. The mountains rose up on either side like jagged teeth. The wind was coming from the northeast at approximately 12 knots, not ideal but workable. What concerned her more was the length of the runway and their current descent rate. The mathematics were brutally simple. They needed to touch down within the first 2,000 feet of runway to have any realistic chance of stopping before the far end. "Okay," she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "We're going for it. Marcus, call out every 500 feet. I want to know exactly where we are relative to the runway threshold." "Copy," Marcus said. His fear had transformed completely now. He was focused, professional, operating at the peak of his capabilities. "You've got this, Sarah." She didn't respond. She was already deep in the moment, in that psychological space where civilians couldn't follow. Her fighter pilot training had prepared her for exactly this scenario, not engine failure specifically, but the requirement to perform perfectly when the consequences of imperfection were measured in human lives. She'd practiced carrier landings in simulators, trying to land F-16s on pitching decks in darkness and fog. She'd trained for emergency approaches with hydraulic failures, with instrument failures, with damage to the airframe. She'd learned to trust the marriage of her instincts and her training, to move her hands through the precise corrections that the aircraft demanded. The approach vector was coming together. Sarah began a shallow turn to align the aircraft with the runway. The turn had to be gradual, had to minimize the additional descent that any banking maneuver created. She was working at the absolute edge of what the aircraft could do. Any more pitch down and she'd gain speed but lose altitude too quickly. Any more pitch up and she'd slow down and risk a stall. The balance was exquisite, delicate, and absolutely critical. 3,500 feet, Marcus called, 2 miles out. Sarah could see the runway markings now, could see the elevation markers, could see the highway that ran parallel to the airport. She could see the ground crew already mobilizing, fire trucks racing toward the runway, emergency personnel assembling. Someone had alerted the airport. Someone had understood what was about to happen. A light aircraft was landing without power, and every emergency vehicle within 50 miles was probably rushing to Eagle County. The descent was working. The glide path was perfect. Sarah was doing something that most pilots would consider impossible. She was managing the descent of a 54,000-pound aircraft with no engine power, and she was going to land it on a runway that was really too short, in a situation that aviation statistics said should result in fatalities. But Sarah had never been much for statistics. She'd always been about precision and preparation. 2,000 feet, Marcus said. 1.5 miles, you're looking good. Sarah's hands made micro-adjustments to the control yoke. Her feet worked the rudder pedals with minute movements, maintaining alignment with the runway. Her entire being had collapsed into this single moment, this single task. There was no cabin full of screaming passengers, no regulatory investigation waiting, no career implications. There was only the aircraft, the runway, and the physics that governed the meeting of the two. She'd flown carrier landings in her military training, the most demanding landings in aviation, where you had to touch down on a specific spot on a moving deck or suffer catastrophic consequences. That training had taught her that the landing began not at touchdown, but at the start of the approach. It taught her that every correction made 3 miles out affected the landing 2 miles out, which affected what happened on touchdown. It taught her that patience and precision were the only things that mattered. 1,500 feet, Marcus said. 1 mile out, you're perfect on the glide path. The runway was no longer a ribbon in the distance. It was a concrete reality below them, expanding rapidly as they descended. Sarah could see the numbers painted on the approach end, 3000. She could see the threshold markings. She could see the exact spot where she needed the main landing gear to touch the earth. 1,000 feet, half-mile out. Sarah's military call sign had been earned after she'd ejected from a damaged F-16, after she'd nearly died, after she'd fought her way back to flight status. Phoenix, rising from the ashes. In this moment, descending toward Eagle County Airport in a powerless aircraft, she was going to earn that call sign all over again. Not through catastrophic failure and recovery, but through precision and preparation so complete that it transcended the impossible. 500 feet, quarter mile, you're looking perfect. The runway was enormous now, filling the entire forward view. Sarah could see the individual markings on the concrete. She could see the perspective lines that guided pilots to the correct descent angle. She could see the light poles on either side of the runway. She could hear Marcus breathing, could feel the weight of every life on this aircraft resting on her hands. 300 feet, you're stable, you're perfect. Sarah's right hand made a small adjustment to the pitch control, keeping the aircraft at exactly the right angle. Too steep, and they'd hit too hard. Too shallow, and they'd float down the runway and not stop. The mathematics of landing an aircraft were exquisite in their demands. 100 feet, 50 feet. The runway was everything now. There was nothing else in the world but the concrete below, the aircraft around her, and the 190 lives that depended on the next 10 seconds. 20 feet, 10 feet. The main landing gear kissed the concrete with a puff of smoke from the tires. The sound was not the crisp touchdown of a powered landing. It was a firm, solid contact, the landing gear compressing, the aircraft settling onto the pavement with the finality of a committal. Gear down, Marcus shouted. We're on. But Sarah wasn't celebrating yet. The aircraft was still moving at 60 knots, eating up runway. She deployed the forward slip maneuver, a technique rarely used in commercial aviation but essential for maximizing descent rate without increasing airspeed. The nose of the aircraft skewed sideways to the runway, and the fuselage became a brake, bleeding off their remaining velocity. The nose gear kissed down. The aircraft decelerated, slowed, bled off the last of its energy. 60 knots, 50, 40, 30, 20. The aircraft rolled to a stop, with 800 feet of runway remaining. In the cabin, someone screamed. Then another voice. Then the entire aircraft erupted into a cacophony of relief and prayer and gratitude and tears. Sarah sat motionless in the captain's chair, her hands still gripping the yoke, her eyes fixed ahead at the emergency vehicles now flooding onto the runway toward them. They had survived. The investigation report was released on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning, Sarah's life had transformed into something she no longer recognized. The National Transportation Safety Board had completed their preliminary investigation with remarkable speed, driven by the extraordinary nature of the incident and the clear narrative of what had transpired. A manufacturing defect in both engines, a catastrophic coincidence of mechanical failures, and a pilot whose response had prevented what statistics said should have been a mass casualty event. The report contained 3 sentences that changed everything. Captain Sarah Mitchell holds a current military pilot certification with the United States Air National Guard, 144th Fighter Wing, Colorado. Her advanced training in emergency procedures and high-stress decision-making under extreme conditions appears to have been directly applicable to the successful management of this dual-engine failure scenario. The level of precision demonstrated during the emergency descent and landing approach suggests training regimens beyond those typically required for commercial aviation operations. That was all it took. Within 6 hours, the connection had been made. Within 12 hours, news crews had discovered that the Sarah Mitchell piloting regional routes out of Denver was the same Sarah Mitchell who held the rank of major in the Colorado Air National Guard. Within 24 hours, her phone had stopped ringing because it was so constantly in use that the carrier's system had crashed trying to handle the call volume. Sarah sat in her apartment on Sunday morning, watching her face flash across cable news networks with a frequency that felt obscene. They'd found photographs of her in her military flight suit, walking across the tarmac at the Guard base. They'd interviewed her squadron mates, who spoke glowingly of her professionalism and dedication. They'd obtained her military service record, classified information made somehow public through channels she didn't understand and couldn't control. They'd even found high school yearbook photos, showing a younger Sarah with a smile that seemed from another lifetime. The airline wanted to make her their spokesman. They wanted her face on billboards, her story in advertisements, her endorsement of their safety record. The military wanted her for speaking engagements. The Air National Guard Public Affairs Office was fielding offers for interviews, book deals, movie rights. Everyone wanted a piece of Phoenix. Everyone wanted to understand how a military fighter pilot had been hiding in plain sight, flying regional routes with civilians who had no idea they were being piloted by someone trained in ways most commercial pilots never experienced. Sarah had declined every offer. She'd given a carefully prepared statement through her lawyer, expressing gratitude that everyone on Flight 447 had survived, acknowledging the role that her military training had played, and respectfully requesting privacy as she processed what had happened. The statement had been released on Monday. By Tuesday morning, reporters were camped outside her apartment building. By Wednesday, they'd obtained her address and were calling her neighbors. She called in sick to the airline on Thursday. She couldn't face flying, couldn't face the attention, couldn't face the transformation of what had been a moment of professional competence into a narrative of heroic exceptionalism. Because that's what bothered her most, the way the story had been rewritten. What had happened on Flight 447 wasn't heroic. It was simply what she'd trained herself to do. It was the natural outcome of preparation meeting crisis. If she was a hero, then what about every other pilot who studied emergency procedures, who trained relentlessly, who prepared for moments that hopefully would never come? What about every professional who understood that competence was a form of responsibility? On Friday morning, Sarah received a visitor. Colonel James Hartwick, her commanding officer at the Guard base, arrived at her apartment without warning. He was a man in his early 60s, with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in military service. He wore his dress uniform, which made Sarah understand immediately that this wasn't a casual visit. "At ease, Major," he said when she stood to greet him. He was being formal, which meant something official was happening. "I'm not here in any official capacity today, though I wanted to wear the uniform so you'd understand that I'm speaking as someone who has known you through both your identities." Sarah gestured for him to sit. He declined. You're wondering why you shouldn't just disappear, Colonel Hartwick said without preamble. Why you shouldn't resign from both the airline and the Guard, move somewhere remote, and try to rebuild a private life away from all this attention. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. How did you? Because I know you, he said. You're a private person. You never sought attention. You built yourself into a pilot not for glory or recognition, but because excellence matters to you. Because you believe that preparation is a form of love. Love for the people who depend on you. Love for the craft itself. Love for the principle that you can make a difference if you're willing to sacrifice what others won't. Sarah looked away. The thing you need to understand, Colonel Hartwick continued, is that what happened on Flight 447 wasn't exceptional. It was what we train people to do, but it was exceptional in the sense that you actually did it. You didn't freeze. You didn't panic. You didn't default to procedure when procedure had become inadequate. You did what your training had prepared you to do, and you saved 190 lives doing it. I was just doing my job, Sarah said quietly. Exactly, Colonel Hartwick said. And that's the message the world needs to hear. Not that you're some superhuman hero, but that this is what professional excellence looks like. This is what it means to take your work seriously, to train relentlessly, to prepare for moments that hopefully will never come. This is what thousands of military pilots do, what thousands of commercial pilots do, what thousands of professionals in every field do. Most of them never face a crisis where their preparation becomes literally life-saving. You did, and the world should see that. Sarah looked back at him. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to do one interview, Colonel Hartwick said. One serious, in-depth conversation where you talk about your training, your preparation, why you believed it was important, what you were thinking in those moments when everything was falling apart. I'm asking you to use this moment, this temporary attention that you've been given, to talk about something deeper than just the story of one flight. I'm asking you to talk about what it means to truly prepare yourself for responsibility. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and after that, you go back to work, Colonel Hartwick said. You fly regional routes. You serve in the Guard 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. You live the life you chose before anyone knew about Phoenix. But you'll have said something that matters. You'll have used this attention to remind people that heroes aren't born, they're built, one training flight at a time. Sarah thought about the 190 passengers who had disembarked at Eagle County Airport. She thought about the families who would have lost loved ones if things had gone differently. She thought about the next pilot who faced a crisis and had to make a split-second decision. Maybe her voice, her story, her willingness to talk about preparation and discipline would somehow make a difference. Okay, she said, one interview. Colonel Hartwick nodded. Good, because Phoenix doesn't rise alone. She rises to help others see what's possible. That evening, Sarah stood on her apartment balcony looking out over Denver. Somewhere out there, Flight 447 had landed safely. Somewhere out there, 190 people were going about their lives, forever changed by something they might never fully understand. And here she was, Sarah Mitchell, a pilot who had simply done what she'd trained herself to do. The fact that it had been extraordinary didn't make it heroic. It made it exactly what everyone should expect when they stepped onto an aircraft. She'd built her life on the principle that excellence was a responsibility, not a choice. Flight 447 had simply been the moment when that responsibility became real.